Hello and welcome to this edition of World at War. My name is Mohammed Saleh. In the middle of the night, the United States and the United Kingdom wreaked havoc on what they claimed are Houthi targets in Yemen. The furious war that exploded in the Gaza Strip on the 7th of October had stirred the waters of the Red Sea. In solidarity with the Palestinians, the Yemeni Houthis had effectively shut down the Red Sea corridor for commercial trade with Israel. For more than 3 months, the United States, which had continuously supplied weapons to Israel, had been projecting power by stationing its aircraft carriers. Antony Blinken's stated objective for his shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East was to ensure that the Israel-Gaza war would not spill beyond the borders of Gaza. But now, for the very first time in this war, the United States has very conspicuously pulled the trigger. So what do these airstrikes by the United States and the United Kingdom mean for the larger trajectory of the war? And with these strikes, has Joe Biden now formally dragged the United States of America into yet another war in a year where he is seeking a re-election to the White House on the basis of his performance? Our next report gets you more details.
In the dead of the night, at a time when no one expected, the United States and the United Kingdom unleashed havoc on Yemen. In wave after wave, fighter jets took off from the nearby stationed aircraft carriers, and within a matter of minutes, more than 150 precision-guided munitions were dropped on 72 different targets.
For the Houthis' actions.
According to the Americans, what were hit were Houthi assets, such as command and control nodes, munition depots, air defense radar systems, launch pads, and production facilities. It soon emerged that 7 different cities in the Houthi-controlled part of Yemen had been struck, including the international airport in the capital Sana'a, along with the Al Dalami air base on the outskirts of the capital city, the Taiz International Airport, the port of Hodeidah, the Abs airfield, the Kalan camp, Zabid, and Damar. Eyewitness videos, such as this one from Hodeidah, showing putrid white smoke and large inferno after the impact of the American drop bombs began to go viral on social media. Along with the fighter jets, Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from ships such as the USS Philippine Sea, the USS Gravely, and the USS Mason took part in these strikes. The Ohio-class submarine USS Florida is also reported to have been a part of the airstrikes. The American representative at the UNSC defended the airstrikes.
The aim of these strikes was to disrupt and degrade the Houthis' ability to continue their reckless attacks against vessels and commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. These strikes were necessary and they were proportionate, as you just heard from my UK colleague. They were consistent with international law and an exercise of the United States' inherent right to self-defense, as reflected by Article 51 of the UN Charter.
As the sun rose and the extent of the airstrikes became clear, it emerged that at least 5 people had been killed. There were immediate protests as thousands in Yemen took to the streets condemning the attack by the United States and Britain.
The American and British enemies bear full responsibility for their criminal aggression against our Yemeni people. It will not go unpunished or unanswered. The Yemeni armed forces will not hesitate to target threatening sources and all hostile targets on land and sea in order to defend Yemen, its sovereignty and independence.
There were immediate protests, even in several American cities of the United States. From New York to Washington, anti-war demonstrators chanted, "Hands off Yemen." The price of crude oil jumped by over 1% within hours of the strikes. According to American officials, the Netherlands, Australia, Canada, and Bahrain provided with logistical and intelligence support for the attacks. While Germany, Denmark, New Zealand and South Korea signed a joint statement defending these attacks. In the last 2 months, the Houthis have struck at least 27 ships in the Red Sea corridor. The Houthis claim that these attacks are in solidarity of the Palestinian people, who are bearing the brunt of the Israeli offensive. Anthony Blinken, the American Secretary of State, who so far has made 4 trips of shuttle diplomacy to the Middle East, had time and again reiterated that the US objective was to ensure that the war does not escalate further. But with these military strikes, it appears that the United States has jumped right into the middle of another war theater in Joe Biden's re-election year.
The South American nation of Ecuador was once perceived as a haven of peace, sandwiched between the cocaine-producing Colombia and Peru. Now, renowned as the world's top exporter of bananas, it is in fact home to the biodiverse Galapagos Islands. However, in the past 5 years, things have in fact taken a turn for the worse. Large ports, lax security and endemic corruption have lured foreign drug cartels to its shores. These drug cartels have increasingly felt the heat of war on drugs in countries like Mexico and Colombia, thereby turning their attention to Ecuador. Now, over the past week, Ecuador has witnessed a wave of violence by these drug gangs, which has prompted the newly elected president, Daniel Noboa, to declare a 60-day state of emergency. Now, responding to the government crackdown, the gangs have retaliated with their own declaration of war, threatening to execute civilians and even the security forces. So far, at least about 10 people have been killed in the violence. Vowing not to yield to the narco gangs, Noboa has reaffirmed that Ecuador is now in a state of war against these drug cartels.
Ecuador has been plunged into crisis after years of unchecked mushrooming influence of transnational narco gangs, who use its ports to ship cocaine to the United States and Europe. The latest outburst of violence was triggered by the 7th January prison escape. One of the country's most powerful narco bosses, José Adolfo Macias, better known by the alias Fito. Fito, described as Ecuador's most wanted prisoner, escaped from the La Regional jail in Guayaquil, barely hours before he was set to be transferred to a maximum security prison. He was sentenced to 34 years in 2011 for several crimes, including murder and drug trafficking. His gang, Los Choneros, wields considerable clout in Ecuador's prisons. The next day, a string of riots were reported from at least 6 prisons. More than 100 prison guards and administrative staff were taken hostage by inmates who threatened to kill them in case of any action. At least 39 reportedly broke out of a prison in the city of Riobamba, including Fabricio Colón Pico, or El Salvage, leader of the Los Lobos group. In addition to the prison riots, bombs exploded at several locations across the country. The same day, in his first decree since coming to power in November, 36-year-old President Daniel Noboa declared a state of emergency and nighttime curfew for the next 60 days. He also classified 22 gangs as terrorist organizations in his decree.
I've given clear indications to the police and military commanders to intervene in the control of the prisons. I've just signed a decree of state of emergency so the armed forces can have all the political and legal support in their actions. I make a call to all citizens because this fight corresponds to everyone, so they should also give their support to the armed forces.
In a brazen attack the next day in the port city of Guayaquil at around 2 p.m. local time, attackers wearing balaclavas stormed a state-owned TV station. In dramatic scenes broadcast live before police arrived, guns were pointed at TV staff, asking them to lie on the floor. Several journalists and staff members were taken hostage, albeit briefly. 13 suspected gunmen were arrested and all hostages freed in the rescue operation. This attack, in which some of the attackers were as young as 16, panicked the general population, prompting them to leave work and close shops. Fearful citizens found themselves staring at an uncertain future.
We still have to go out every day because nobody will solve the money issue for us. But we are very afraid, with a lot of uncertainty, both financial and personal. You don't know what is going to happen today, what is going to happen in the next few days, if there will be a solution soon. That's the uncertainty that we live with day by day.
The same day, neighboring Peru declared a state of emergency along its northern border with Ecuador, sending an additional 500 soldiers to secure the frontier. The severity of the situation in Ecuador can be gauged by some of the statistics. The country's murder rate has quadrupled from 2018 to 2022. With the last year being the worst yet, with 7,800 murders in a population of about 17 million. In addition to this, a record 220 tons of drugs were seized as well. The burgeoning crisis is the toughest challenge for Daniel Noboa, barely 2 months into his term, who had pledged to curb violence of narco gangs in his election campaign. Will Noboa succeed in his fight against narco gangs? A 17 million strong nation, anxious and panic-stricken, awaits.
The Myanmar junta has faced its sternest challenge to its authority since grabbing power in a 2021 coup by an alliance of 3 Myanmar ethnic minority groups called the Brotherhood Alliance, who engaged a coordinated offensive since the 27th of October, thereby rattling the Myanmarese military. The offensive, named by the rebels as Operation 1027, signifying the date on which the offensive began, has made its inroads into the junta-controlled areas in the northern Shan state, the Kaya state in the east, and also the Rakhine state in the west. Now, in a major breakthrough of sorts, the Myanmar's ruling junta and the Brotherhood Alliance have yet again agreed to a ceasefire on the 12th of January. Yet again, a result of Beijing-mediated peace talks. But the question is this: will this ceasefire between the Myanmar junta and the rebels hold? Our next report gets you more details.
The South Asian nation of Myanmar was plunged into crisis when Myanmar military removed the democratically elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi in a military coup in February 2021. Mass protests against this illegal power grab erupted. Military generals responded to these nationwide protests with brute force, further antagonizing their civilian opponents. According to the Assistance Association for Political Prisoners, more than 25,730 people have been arrested for opposing the coup, with almost 20,000 of them still in detention. It has proven to be an uphill task for the military junta to contain the dogged resistance to its rule. On the 27th of October, a coalition of 3 ethnic rebel groups known as the Brotherhood Alliance, the Tang National Liberation Army, the Arakan Army, and the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, or MNDAA, launched coordinated attacks on the military across a swathe of Myanmar's northern Shan state. The Brotherhood Alliance is believed to have a strength of 15,000 fighters. Reportedly, they have overrun more than 100 military posts, captured border crossings, and the vital roads carrying most of the overland trade with China. On Friday, in a positive development, Beijing announced that it has negotiated an immediate ceasefire.
With the mediation and facilitation of the Chinese side, the Myanmar army and representatives from 3 militias of northern Myanmar, namely the MNDAA, the TNLA, and the Arakan army, held peace talks in China's Kunming on January 10 and 11 and reached a formal agreement. The two sides agreed to an immediate ceasefire to disengage military personnel and resolve relevant disputes and demands through peaceful negotiations. Both sides pledged not to compromise the safety of Chinese border residents and Chinese personnel in Myanmar. The two sides also held consultations on other issues, such as ceasefire arrangements.
However, fighting continued in the North Shan state and other regions, with the rebels taking control of a key commercial town, La O Kai, on the Chinese border last week. La O Kai, run by a Myanmar military-aligned militia, is notorious for gambling, prostitution and online scams. United Nations fears that thousands have been displaced by the fighting, with some fleeing across the border into China and India. In the last 2 months, more than 400 Myanmar army personnel have entered India through the porous border.
The activities of the Myanmar army and the ethnic armed organization and the PDF in the recent past couple of months, which has resulted in some of the Myanmar army personnel walking across, about 416 of them till date. Because of the situation across the Indo-Myanmar border, you also have some of the insurgent groups who are feeling the pressure and who have now attempted to come onto our side of the border in the state of Manipur.
So far, Indian authorities have been sending back the Myanmar army personnel within days of them crossing over. But the bigger question here is, will this ceasefire agreement be honored, further strengthened, and ultimately result in the resolution of the conflict through dialogue and consultations?
A 14-day state of emergency was declared in Papua New Guinea's capital on the 11th of January, after at least about 15 people were killed in riots as crowds looted and burnt shops. Reportedly, more than 1,000 troops were in fact on a standby to step in wherever necessary. The police and the public sector protest was triggered over a pay cut, which officials have now blamed on an administrative glitch. In a bid to try and rectify the rapidly deteriorating situation, the Prime Minister, James Marape, has now suspended the Chief of Police and also the top bureaucrats in the Finance and Treasury departments, while the government is conducting a review. Our next report gets more details.
Papua New Guinea is a diverse, developing, mostly rural nation of subsistence farmers. As many as 839 languages are known to exist here, making it one of the most linguistically diverse nations in the world. Strategically significant, it is the most populous nation in the South Pacific after Australia, with about 10 million people. Historically, however, it has struggled to contain escalating tribal violence and civil unrest in remote regions. On the 10th of January, the island nation descended into lawlessness amid a festering pay dispute. Hundreds of police officers, soldiers, prison staff and public servants walked off their jobs and poured onto the streets of the capital Moresby. They were protesting unexplained deductions to their pay. Within hours, the unrest also spread to Leh, the second biggest city of Papua New Guinea, about 300 kilometers to the north of the capital. As black smoke billowed over the city, looters were seen dashing into stores through glass windows,
grabbing whatever they could and stuffing stolen goods into cardboard boxes, shopping trolleys and plastic buckets. Buildings and cars were set ablaze. Reportedly, 25 people with gunshot wounds were treated at Port Moresby's largest hospital. The scale of destruction was unprecedented in the past 50 years, according to some locals. A local newspaper dubbed it as the city's darkest day. To bring the situation under control, Prime Minister James Marape declared a 14-day state of emergency in the nation's capital.
Today we call for a state of emergency for 14 days in our nation's capital. There were recommendations for outside forces to come in or for us to seek help elsewhere, but we decided that under the provisions of Section 226 of our Constitution, as well as the constitutional provision that we utilized yesterday to get police to come in, Section 204 of our Constitution, to get defense to come in to assist our police in the call-out. We thought these are sufficient for the moment. We have over 1,000 men from Defense Force ready on standby to come in and work under state of emergency laws within the next 14 days to step in wherever necessary to contain any situations that may arise going forward into the future.
At one stage, a small crowd had gathered outside the Prime Minister's office in Port Moresby as well. They tore a security gate off its rails and proceeded to torch a parked police car. What explains this unprecedented level of strife and civil unrest? High unemployment and increased cost of living, coupled with high levels of crime, have made life increasingly difficult, with almost 40% of the population still below the poverty line. The government for now has promised to redress the payroll glitch and look into the causes that led to it.
Heads of these agencies and departments step aside. The next 14 days, the administrative review into what took place, including look at police, look at treasury, looking at finance, looking at personal management, thinking. So we ensure this sort of thing does not happen again. But more importantly, we secure democracy, we secure rule of law.
The important question, though, is, will these measures be enough to pacify the disgruntled citizens of a country blessed with vast deposits of gas, gold and minerals, but still finds itself plagued by poverty and high crime rate?
And with that, it's a wrap on this edition of World at War. And if you want to reach out to me with any comments, feedback or suggestions, please feel free to do so on the ID that you're seeing on your screens. I'm your host, Mohammed Saleh, and I'll see you again next week.